stone halls that echo with prayers for the dying, where monks in black robes wield both scalpel and sword. Fortress islands rise from azure waters, their walls bristling with cannon as Ottoman fleets darken the horizon. Merchant princes transform into warrior saints, their hospitals becoming bastions, their charity evolving into conquest. This is the epic of history's most paradoxical brotherhood. Healers who became crusaders, servants who ruled islands, holy men who commanded fleets. From Jerusalem's shadowed alleys to Malta's golden harbors, they forged an empire built not on territory, but on an impossible dream, that mercy and might could share the same banner. Follow the rise of humble servants turned seaborne legends, where sacred vows clash with worldly power, and the pursuit of mercy fuels an empire. Over a millennium of healing and warfare, their story is a testament to how compassion can conquer the impossible. The wind carried the scent of frankincense and human suffering through the narrow streets of Jerusalem as dawn broke over the holy city in the year 1048. Within the shadow of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, where pilgrims from across Christendom knelt in prayer at the site of Christ's crucifixion, a different kind of devotion was taking shape. Here, in a modest stone building that had once served as a way station for weary travelers, a group of Amalfitan merchants was about to establish something that would outlast empires and reshape the medieval world. Merchants from Amalfi possessed advantages that made them natural founders of such an enterprise. Their maritime republic, perched on the cliffs of southern Italy, had grown wealthy through trade networks spanning the Mediterranean. These seasoned traders understood the needs of international travelers better than any monastery or royal court. Years of witnessing the perils that faced faithful pilgrims journeying to the sacred sites of the Holy Land, disease, bandits, exhaustion, and the thousand misfortunes that could befall travelers thousands of miles from home, had taught them lessons that purely ecclesiastical institutions often missed. What began as a practical business arrangement gradually transformed into something far more profound. Initially, the Amalfitans had established their outpost in the sacred city to serve the commercial needs of their fellow merchants and the growing stream of pilgrims who brought coin to spend on lodging, food, and artifacts. Yet as they witnessed the suffering of those who arrived sick, wounded, or destitute, mere commercial calculation gave way to something approaching divine calling. Inspiration for their infirmary drew from a model that had flourished centuries earlier along the Nile. In Alexandria, the sanctuary of St. John the Almsgiver had served travelers and the poor for generations, demonstrating that organized charity could operate on a scale far exceeding what individual monasteries typically attempted. Through their extensive trade connections, the Amalfitan merchants had grown familiar with this Egyptian precedent and recognized the potential for establishing something similar in the ultimate destination for faithful pilgrimage. Near the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, they acquired a modest building that reflected both practical necessity and profound symbolism. Proximity to Christianity's holiest site ensured a steady stream of visitors requiring assistance, while the location itself suggested that caring for the sick and poor constituted an essential component of authentic devotion. More than a charitable institution, the merchants were creating a new model for expressing faith through systematic aid to those in need. From this community of dedicated caregivers emerged Brother Gerard, who became the driving force behind the infirmary's transformation from a simple charitable institution into something approaching a sacred brotherhood. His background remains shrouded in the fragmentary records of an age when most men left little trace of their existence, yet his impact proved both immediate and enduring. Unlike many ecclesiastical leaders of his era, who emphasized contemplation and withdrawal from worldly concerns. Girard understood that authentic spirituality required engagement with human suffering in its most concrete and immediate forms. Around the 1080s, Girard composed what would become known as the Rule of Blessed Girard, representing one of the first systematic attempts to organize healing work according to spiritual principles. This revolutionary document established procedures for admitting patients, standards for treatment, guidelines for managing resources, and sacred obligations for those who served the sick. More significantly, it created a synthesis between monastic devotion and practical aid that would influence ecclesiastical life throughout the medieval period. Girard's genius lay in his recognition that caring for the sick required both spiritual dedication and practical expertise. Men who served in his institution underwent training that combined sacred instruction with medical education. They learned to prepare medicines from herbs, to set broken bones, to recognize symptoms of various diseases, and to provide comfort to the dying. This integration of spiritual and healing work created capabilities that exceeded anything available at contemporary monasteries or secular institutions. Adapting Benedictine monastic principles to healing work represented a theological innovation that would influence sacred thinking for centuries. Traditional monasticism emphasized withdrawal from worldly concerns, but Girard's community embraced engagement with human suffering as the highest form of spiritual devotion. Poverty, chastity, and obedience, the traditional vows, were supplemented by a fourth commitment, aid to the sick and poor, that would later evolve into the famous motto Tuitio Fidei et Obsequium Pauperum, defense of the faith and assistance to the poor. Soon, the institution's reputation for excellence attracted support from the most powerful figures in the emerging Crusader states. Godfrey of Bouillon, the hero of the First Crusade and first ruler of the Holy City, provided the land grants and legal privileges that enabled the foundation to expand beyond its modest origins. His successor, Baldwin I, extended royal protection and additional endowments that transformed Girard's infirmary into one of the wealthiest and most influential institutions in the Latin East. These early benefactors understood that the sanctuary served functions far beyond simple charity. In a region where European settlers constituted a small minority, surrounded by potentially hostile populations, institutions that demonstrated compassion while maintaining discipline and organization possessed strategic as well as spiritual value. When wounded soldiers needed treatment, when diseases unknown to Europeans required expert attention, when stability needed maintaining during crises, the Foundation proved an indispensable component of Crusader society. Everything changed with the First Crusade's conquest of the sacred city in 1099. Suddenly, a massive influx of European settlers arrived. Feudal principalities were established throughout the Levant. An ongoing warfare between opposing forces generated new demands for the aid that the institution provided. More significantly, the crusading movement's emphasis on holy war began to influence thinking about how sacred institutions should respond to threats against the faith. At the Battle of Ascalon in 1099, history witnessed a momentous transformation. Girard's followers took up arms alongside the crusading army that faced the last major threat to the newly conquered territories. For the first time, men who had dedicated their lives to caring for the sick deliberately chose to participate in warfare. Rather than abandoning their charitable mission, they were expanding their understanding of what protecting the vulnerable might require in a hostile environment. Gradually, driven by practical necessity rather than theoretical considerations, the transformation from healing attendants to fighting knights occurred. Pilgrimage routes to the Holy City passed through territories controlled by Muslim forces, who viewed travelers as legitimate targets for raids and enslavement. Protecting these vulnerable souls required more than passive attention for those who arrived wounded. It demanded active intervention against those who threatened them. Reflecting this expanding mission, their vows evolved accordingly. Poverty, chastity, and obedience remained fundamental, but now they were interpreted within a context that included defense of the faith as an essential component of authentic devotion. This fourth vow would eventually develop into a comprehensive ideology that justified armed action as a form of spiritual duty equal to caring for the sick. During this transitional period, martial innovations began emerging from the community that drew upon expertise accumulated through decades of practical experience. Men who had treated countless battlefield injuries possessed intimate knowledge of weapons and their effects. They understood which injuries proved fatal, which could be treated effectively, and what protective equipment offered the best defense against various threats. Healing knowledge translated directly into tactical expertise that proved invaluable on medieval battlefields, creating capabilities that no purely monastic or purely warrior organization could match. The integration of healing and martial duties proved revolutionary. Gerard's followers, who rode to battle, carried medical supplies and expertise that could save lives during and after combat. Their facilities provided secure bases where wounded soldiers could receive treatment unavailable anywhere else in the region. Most importantly, their dual mission attracted recruits who might have been unwilling to join either a traditional monastery or a purely fighting force. In 1113, papal recognition under Pope Paschal II represented far more than simple acknowledgement of an existing institution. Through the bull Pae Postulatio Voluntatis, the community was established as an independent, sacred organization, answerable directly to Rome rather than to local ecclesiastical or secular authorities. This papal privilege created unprecedented autonomy that would enable the Brotherhood to develop its own policies, accumulate vast resources, and expand across multiple kingdoms without interference from local power structures. Broader changes in how the Church understood its role in supporting the Crusader states influenced the timing of papal recognition. Pope Paschal II faced the challenge of maintaining European enthusiasm for the crusading movement while providing practical support for the settlements that had been established in the East. Sacred organizations that combined spiritual devotion with practical aid offered ideal instruments for advancing church interests in the volatile environment of the Latin East. Institutional frameworks that would enable systematic expansion across Europe and the Mediterranean emerged from the formal establishment of the Brotherhood. Papal authorization allowed the creation of commanderies, local foundations that would recruit members, accumulate resources, and channel support toward activities in the Holy Land. This network structure allowed the organization to draw upon the wealth and manpower of the entire Latin world while maintaining unity of purpose and direction. Early conflicts that tested the new organization's martial capabilities provided valuable experience in the realities of warfare in the Eastern Mediterranean. Unlike European battlefields, where opponents typically shared similar equipment, tactics, and cultural assumptions, combat in the Levant required adaptation to enemies who possessed different traditions, superior knowledge of local conditions, and sophisticated siege techniques developed through centuries of regional warfare. Initially, Muslim opponents dismissed Gerard's followers as amateur soldiers whose healing training made them unsuitable for serious combat. This underestimation proved costly when the men demonstrated that their combination of disciplined organization, practical knowledge, and sacred motivation created fighting capabilities that exceeded those of traditional feudal levies. Their willingness to accept casualties while maintaining formation discipline made them formidable opponents in both siege and field operations, continuing to influence martial development in ways that distinguished it from purely warrior organizations. The community's healing mission drove innovation in battlefield medicine that reduced mortality rates and enabled faster recovery from wounds. Understanding of nutrition, disease prevention, and physical conditioning translated into advantages that became apparent during prolonged campaigns, where health and endurance proved as important as individual fighting skills. Reflecting their scientific approach to problems that other fighting organizations addressed through tradition and instinct alone, Gerard's followers pursued systematic study of enemy tactics and weapons. Men who treated wounds inflicted by various weapons accumulated detailed knowledge about the effectiveness of different technologies. They understood which armor provided optimal protection, which weapons proved most effective in specific circumstances, and which tactical formations minimized casualties while maximizing offensive capability. Throughout this early period, recruitment networks established patterns that would characterize the organization throughout its history. Unlike traditional monasteries that drew primarily from local populations, the Foundation attracted candidates from across Europe who were motivated by the combination of sacred devotion and martial adventure that it offered. Younger sons of noble families who possessed combat training but lacked inheritance prospects found in the Brotherhood, opportunities for meaningful duty that satisfied both spiritual aspirations and desire for action. Beginning with donations from grateful patients and pilgrims, the economic foundations supporting the organization's expanding activities rapidly grew to encompass systematic support from the European nobility. Kings and princes who had participated in the crusading movement understood the strategic value of maintaining institutions that could provide ongoing support for presence in the East. Their endowments of land, commercial privileges, and monetary grants created the financial base that would enable the Brotherhood to maintain large fighting forces across multiple theaters of operation. Within less than a century, the transformation from a modest infirmary serving pilgrims to a martial organization capable of fielding armies represented one of the most remarkable institutional developments of the medieval period. Gerard's community of dedicated caregivers had evolved into a brotherhood that combined the spiritual devotion of the finest monasteries with the combat capabilities of the most effective knightly organizations. This synthesis of seemingly contradictory functions created something entirely new in European civilization, demonstrating sophistication that rivaled the governmental institutions of major kingdoms. The administrative systems that emerged to manage the Brotherhood's growing responsibilities influenced administrative practice throughout medieval Europe. Record-keeping procedures, financial management techniques, and communication networks developed within the organization provided models that secular rulers would later adapt for their own purposes. The community's systematic approach to managing complex operations across vast distances established precedents for international organization, resolving contradictions that had long troubled theological thinkers. Innovations that justified the organization's dual mission presented armed action as a form of charitable activity. Traditional theology had emphasized the incompatibility between worldly violence and spiritual devotion, but Gerard's followers developed frameworks that presented protecting pilgrims and defending the Holy Land as acts of mercy comparable to caring for the sick, since both activities served vulnerable populations threatened by forces beyond their control. By 1113, When papal recognition formally established the Brotherhood, the transformation was complete. What had begun as a practical response to the needs of faithful pilgrims had become a new model for sacred life that would influence European civilization for centuries. An institution that Amalfitan merchants had established to aid travelers had evolved into an international organization capable of challenging the greatest powers of the medieval world. Growing involvement in the political and martial affairs of the Crusader states positioned the Brotherhood to play decisive roles in the conflicts that would determine whether control of the Holy Land could be maintained. Men who had learned to balance spiritual devotion with practical duty were about to discover whether their innovations would prove sufficient to preserve the sacred sites that had inspired their original mission. Achievements that would establish the foundation as one of the most formidable organizations in human history lay ahead. A modest settlement that had sheltered sick pilgrims was about to become the headquarters of a warrior brotherhood whose influence would span continents and endure for nearly a millennium. As this new age began, the medieval world would never be the same. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty training yards of the sacred city as Raymond Dupuis surveyed the transformation taking place before his eyes. When he assumed leadership of the community in 1120, he inherited an institution caught between two worlds: the contemplative traditions of monastic life and the harsh realities of frontier warfare. What emerged under his guidance would become the template for every warrior establishment that followed. A revolutionary synthesis that turned healers into history's most formidable fighting force. Raymond understood that Gerard's foundation required more than occasional martial participation to survive in the volatile world of the Crusader states. Systematic transformation was necessary, not just of individual capabilities, but of the entire institutional structure. Drawing upon his own experience as both a knight and a devoted caregiver, he began implementing changes that would revolutionize how the community operated while preserving the spiritual mission that had originally inspired its creation. His first innovation addressed the fundamental challenge of maintaining dual commitments to healing and warfare. Rather than forcing every member to master both disciplines equally, Raymond created specialized roles within the Knights that allowed men to focus on their particular strengths while contributing to the establishment's overall mission. Some concentrated on perfecting medical techniques and managing the infirmaries, while others devoted themselves entirely to combat preparation and martial duties. This specialization enabled unprecedented levels of expertise in both areas. The healing specialists who remained focused on medical work developed innovations that revolutionized surgical techniques throughout the medieval world. They pioneered new methods for treating battlefield injuries, created sophisticated arrangements for managing large-scale medical facilities, and established instruction programs that produced the most skilled physicians available anywhere in the Latin East. Meanwhile, the warriors who concentrated on martial pursuits became legendary for their discipline, courage, and tactical sophistication. Unlike traditional knights who learned combat through informal apprenticeships and battlefield experience, these men underwent systematic preparation that emphasized coordination, endurance, and the specialized techniques required for assault warfare. Their black surcoats emblazoned with white crosses became symbols of unyielding determination that struck fear into enemies throughout the region. Yet Raymond's most significant contribution lay in his recognition that effective protection of the Crusader states required more than individual excellence. It demanded calculated thinking on a scale that no previous generation had attempted. The scattered cities and strongholds of the Latin East needed coordinated safeguarding, that could respond rapidly to threats emerging from any direction. Creating such a protective network required resources, planning, and architectural capabilities that would test every aspect of the establishment's developing capabilities. The solution emerged in the form of the greatest fortification building program the medieval world had ever witnessed. Beginning with modest renovations of existing structures, Raymond's architects gradually developed the expertise necessary to construct entirely new bulwarks, designed specifically for the unique challenges of warfare in the Levant. These massive stone complexes would become the backbone of protection for over a century. Crac de Chevalier rose from a calculated hilltop in Syria as the crown jewel of this protective arrangement. When building began in the 1140s, the site commanded crucial routes connecting the coast with inland territories, making it an ideal location for monitoring and controlling movement throughout the region. What emerged over the following decades represented the pinnacle of medieval fortification architecture, a concentric citadel design that incorporated every lesson learned from centuries of assault warfare. The stronghold's outer walls, some sections rising over 30 meters in height, were designed to withstand the most sophisticated attack techniques available to contemporary armies. Massive towers provided overlapping fields of fire that could sweep any approach with devastating crossbow volleys, while carefully planned gates and passages created killing zones where attackers would find themselves trapped under concentrated fire from multiple directions. Inside these formidable barriers, the complex functioned as a complete administrative center, capable of sustaining thousands of inhabitants during extended blockades. Enormous cisterns collected rainwater and stored supplies sufficient for years of isolation, while workshops produced everything from weapons and armor to the medicines needed for treating wounded defenders. Most remarkably, the citadel included facilities for continuing the community's healing mission, even during wartime conditions. Belvoir, erected on the Jordan River's western bank, demonstrated how stronghold design could be adapted to different calculated requirements. Rather than commanding mountain passes like Crac de Chevalier, this bulwark controlled river crossings and agricultural regions that provided much of the Latin East's food production. Its design emphasized rapid deployment of forces to protect surrounding settlements while maintaining secure bases for launching counterattacks against raiders. Margat, perched on the Syrian coast, served as both a citadel and a naval base that enabled coordination between land and sea campaigns. From its towers, observers could monitor shipping along the entire coastline, while signal fires could communicate with other strongholds throughout the region. The keep's calculated position made it a crucial link in the communication network that held the protective framework together. Chastel Rouge, controlling approaches from the Damascus region, represented the furthest extension of the knight's safeguarding perimeter. This redoubt faced the constant threat of attack from the powerful Muslim armies based in Syria's interior, requiring innovations in protective architecture that would influence fortification design throughout Europe. Its massive walls and sophisticated gate arrangements became models that were copied wherever architects needed to create bulwarks capable of withstanding determined assault campaigns. These fortified complexes required financial resources on a scale that dwarfed anything the community had previously attempted. Raymond's solution lay in systematically developing the economic foundations that Gerard had established through charitable donations into a comprehensive financial network spanning all of Europe. The estate arrangement created during this period represented one of history's most successful examples of international coordination and resource management. Holdings established throughout France, England, Germany, Spain, and Italy functioned as both recruitment centers and economic engines that channeled wealth toward the protection of the Holy Land. Each outpost controlled agricultural properties, collected donations from the faithful, managed commercial enterprises, and recruited new members who would either travel east to join the fighting forces or remain in Europe to manage the economic networks that made warfare possible. The agricultural properties controlled by these foundations became showcases of advanced farming techniques that increased productivity while generating surplus revenues for financing campaigns in the East. Innovations in crop rotation, livestock breeding, and land management developed on these estates influenced agricultural practice throughout medieval Europe, while providing the steady income streams necessary for maintaining expensive citadel infrastructure. Commercial enterprises operated by the foundations included everything from shipping and banking to manufacturing and international trade. The knights' reputation for honesty and efficiency made their commercial ventures welcome in markets throughout Europe and the Mediterranean, while the establishment's international character enabled it to coordinate business activities across political boundaries that limited other merchants. Banking ventures that began as simple money changing for pilgrims evolved into sophisticated financial services that facilitated trade throughout the known world. The community's network of secure facilities and trusted agents made it possible to transfer funds across vast distances without the risks associated with carrying precious metals through dangerous territories. These financial innovations contributed to the commercial revolution that transformed European economic life during the medieval period. Recruitment efforts focused on attracting men who possessed both the spiritual commitment necessary for monastic life and the physical capabilities required for warfare in demanding conditions. Unlike traditional monastic establishments that emphasized scholarly pursuits and contemplative practices, the knights sought candidates who could master the complex arts of assault warfare, cavalry combat, and the architectural skills necessary for maintaining massive fortified arrangements. Instruction programs developed during Raymond's leadership established standards for martial excellence that influenced knightly education throughout Europe. New recruits underwent months of intensive drilling in weapons handling, tactical coordination, and the specialized techniques required for assault campaigns. They learned to operate investment engines, coordinate cavalry charges, and fight effectively in the close quarters combat that characterized citadel warfare. Medical preparation remained an essential component of education for all members, regardless of their primary specialization. Even the most dedicated warriors learned basic healing techniques that could save lives in battlefield conditions, while those focused on medical duties received instruction in protective combat that would enable them to protect their patients during blockade conditions. This cross-preparation created unprecedented versatility that gave the knights significant advantages over opponents who lacked such comprehensive readiness. The rivalry and cooperation that developed between the community and the Knights Templar created a dynamic that would influence both establishments throughout their existence in the Holy Land. Initially, the two groups worked together effectively, with the Templars focusing on protecting pilgrimage routes while the Knights concentrated on defending the major fortified arrangements. However, as both institutions grew in power and influence, competition for resources and calculated control created tensions that sometimes undermined collaborative efforts. Specific incidents illustrated both the potential for cooperation and the dangers of rivalry between these powerful institutions. During the protection of Ascalon in 1153, coordinated campaigns between the two groups demonstrated how effective they could be when working toward common objectives. However, disagreements over strategy during the disastrous venture that led to the Battle of Hattin revealed how institutional rivalry could compromise martial effectiveness. Joint ventures against common enemies showcased the combined capabilities that made the two establishments the backbone of Latin East protection. When Saladin launched his systematic campaigns against the Crusader states, both groups participated in safeguarding efforts that demonstrated unprecedented levels of tactical sophistication and calculated coordination. Their citadel networks, communication infrastructure, and professional fighting forces represented the most advanced martial coordination available anywhere in the medieval world. The innovations in assault warfare developed during this period revolutionized combat throughout Europe and the Mediterranean. Architects working for the Knights pioneered new designs for attack towers, battering rams, and earth-moving equipment that could breach even the strongest fortifications. These technological advances were systematically documented and shared throughout the establishment's network, ensuring that improvements developed in one location could be rapidly implemented wherever they might prove useful. Attack towers built by the community's craftsmen reached unprecedented heights and incorporated innovations that dramatically improved their effectiveness. Mobile wooden structures, rising over 40 meters, enabled attacking forces to fight from elevated positions while protecting assault troops from protective fire. These towers included multiple levels for different types of combat troops, sophisticated mechanisms for rapid deployment, and safeguarding features that reduced vulnerability to fire arrows and other protective measures. Battering rams developed during this period could concentrate enormous force against specific targets while protecting the operators from protective fire. The largest of these weapons required teams of over 100 men to operate effectively, but they could breach gates and walls that had previously been considered impregnable. Protective housings covered with metal plates and wet hides reduced vulnerability to safeguarding countermeasures, while specialized wheels and suspension arrangements enabled rapid deployment across difficult terrain. Earth-moving techniques that enabled rapid erection of assault ramps transformed investment warfare by making it possible to bring heavy equipment to bear against previously inaccessible targets. Teams of craftsmen could build massive earthworks in weeks rather than months, using carefully planned logistics to move enormous quantities of stone and soil into positions that enabled direct assault against citadel walls. The systematic study of protective architecture that emerged from these investment campaigns produced detailed knowledge about stronghold design that influenced building throughout the medieval world. Architects who had participated in numerous assault ventures understood exactly which safeguarding features proved most effective and which could be overcome through determined attack. This expertise enabled the knights to construct citadel arrangements that incorporated every available protective innovation. The communication networks linking these scattered fortified complexes represented remarkable achievements in medieval engineering and coordination. Signal towers positioned at calculated intervals could relay messages across hundreds of kilometers within hours, while mounted messengers following established routes could carry detailed reports between any two locations within the protective framework in days rather than weeks. Standardized signal codes enabled rapid transmission of complex information about enemy movements, supply requirements, and calculated developments. Fire signals visible during daylight hours and beacon fires observable at night created communication capabilities that gave the knights significant advantages over enemies who lacked such sophisticated information infrastructure. These networks enabled coordinated responses to threats that might otherwise have overwhelmed isolated stronghold garrisons. The administrative arrangements required to manage these extensive ventures demonstrated institutional sophistication that rivaled the governmental structures of major kingdoms. Record-keeping procedures tracked everything from individual combat assignments to complex supply transactions involving multiple foundations. Financial management frameworks ensured that resources flowed efficiently from European estates to frontier citadel arrangements, while personnel records enabled optimal deployment of specialized capabilities across the entire establishment. Legal frameworks developed during this period established precedents for international law and institutional governance that influenced structural development throughout Europe. The Knights' unique position as an independent entity, answerable directly to the Pope while operating across multiple kingdoms, required innovative approaches to resolving jurisdictional conflicts and managing relationships with secular authorities. Diplomatic activities conducted by the community's leadership demonstrated sophisticated understanding of regional politics and calculated calculation. Representatives who negotiated with Muslim rulers, Byzantine officials, and European monarchs possessed expertise in international relations that enabled them to advance the establishment's interests while maintaining the complex alliances necessary for survival in the volatile environment of the Crusader states. Yet despite these impressive achievements, ominous developments were beginning to threaten the foundations of everything the Knights had built. The rise of Saladin as a unifying force among the Muslim states of Syria and Egypt created a level of coordinated opposition that the fragmented protections of the Latin East would struggle to contain. More troubling still, support from Europe was beginning to waver as the initial enthusiasm for crusading gave way to other priorities and concerns. The disaster at the Battle of Hattin in 1187 revealed the limitations of even the most sophisticated protective arrangements when faced with superior numbers, better coordination, and calculated mistakes by the defenders. Saladin's systematic campaign that followed demonstrated how quickly apparently impregnable citadel networks could collapse once their supporting field armies had been eliminated and their communication infrastructure disrupted. The loss of the sacred city itself in October 1187 marked the beginning of a period of desperate struggle that would test every capability the Knights had developed over the previous century. The stronghold arrangements that had seemed to guarantee the security of the Crusader states suddenly appeared vulnerable, while the economic networks that had funded their building faced disruption from the loss of crucial territories and trade routes. Recovery efforts launched during the Third Crusade demonstrated both the resilience of the community's institutional structure and the limitations imposed by fundamental calculated weaknesses. While individual citadel complexes could be recaptured and protective capabilities restored, the underlying problems of numerical inferiority and limited European support remained unresolved. The gradual erosion of territory that characterized the final century of the Knights' presence in the Holy Land reflected these persistent challenges, rather than any failure of capability or commitment. Acre, the last major stronghold, fell in 1291, not because its barriers had been overcome, but because the broader calculated situation had become untenable. As the final ships departed from the ports of the Holy Land, carrying the remnants of the community toward an uncertain future, they bore with them more than just the survivors of a failed experiment. The innovations in fortification architecture, assault warfare, medical practice, and international coordination that had been developed during these centuries of struggle would influence European civilization for generations to come. The age of the Latin East was ending, but the legacy of those who had defended it would endure far beyond the fall of its last stronghold. The knights who had learned to balance spiritual devotion with practical necessity were about to discover whether the capabilities forged in the fires of Holy Land warfare could find new purposes in a changing world. The salt spray crashed against weathered stone as Fulke de Villeret stood atop the ancient walls of his prize, surveying the stronghold that would transform his exiled warriors into the masters of the eastern seas. 7 years had passed since the fall of Acre. 7 years of wandering, uncertainty, and desperate searches for a new purpose. Now, in 1309, the island's citadel that had once served as a Byzantine seafaring outpost was about to become the foundation of something unprecedented in medieval history, a sovereign maritime state ruled by warrior monks. Villeray understood that mere survival required more than finding refuge. The community that had lost everything in the collapse of the Crusader states needed to reinvent itself completely, or face gradual dissolution. The island's stronghold, with its commanding position along the crucial sea routes connecting Constantinople, Alexandria, and the Italian ports, offered possibilities that went far beyond simple sanctuary. Here, the displaced brotherhood could forge an entirely new identity while remaining true to their fundamental mission. Capturing this strategic outpost demonstrated how thoroughly the warriors had adapted to their changed circumstances. Unlike the land-based siege warfare that had characterized their operations in the Holy Land, securing their new home required coordination between seafaring forces, amphibious assault capabilities, and diplomatic maneuvering with the Byzantine Empire. The 3-year campaign that established their dominion proved that Gerard's successors possessed the flexibility necessary to master entirely new forms of combat. Maritime warfare represented a fundamental departure from everything the Brotherhood had previously mastered. The warships that became their new weapons bore little resemblance to the massive stone citadels they had defended in Syria. These sleek wooden craft, powered by both sail and oar, demanded different skills, different tactics, and entirely different approaches to strategic thinking. Yet the discipline and systematic methodology that had made them legendary fortress builders now enabled them to become equally formidable seafaring commanders. Revolutionary ship designs that emerged from the island shipyards incorporated innovations that would influence regional architecture for centuries. Unlike traditional warships that emphasized either speed or cargo capacity, the Brotherhood's craft achieved unprecedented combinations of maneuverability, firepower, and seaworthiness. These raiders could pursue fleeing enemies across open waters, conduct extended blockades, and carry sufficient supplies for months-long expeditions far from their base. Central to these innovations was the development of specialized artillery designed specifically for seaborne combat. While land-based siege engines had relied primarily on mechanical leverage to hurl projectiles, shipboard weapons needed to function effectively despite the constant motion of craft in rough seas. The solution lay in creating lighter, more flexible weapons that could be rapidly repositioned and fired accurately, even under challenging conditions. Crossbow batteries that lined the gunnels of these revolutionary warships could loose coordinated volleys that devastated enemy crews while leaving their craft relatively intact for capture. This tactical approach reflected the warriors' economic as well as military thinking. Destroying enemy ships eliminated potential prizes, while capturing them intact provided both valuable craft and ransom opportunities for their crews. Greek fire projectors, adapted from Byzantine seafaring technology, gave the Brotherhood's warships devastating close-range capabilities that proved particularly effective against the lighter craft favored by Muslim corsairs. These weapons could project streams of burning liquid across distances of up to 50 meters, creating walls of flame that made approach impossible while the defenders maneuvered for optimal boarding positions. The squadron composition that evolved during the early island period demonstrated sophisticated understanding of the different requirements for various types of maritime operations. Heavy warships served as the backbone of major battles, providing the firepower and boarding capacity necessary for engaging enemy battle formations. Medium craft offered the optimal balance of speed and capability for patrol duties and pursuing raiders. Light raiders and specialized scout ships provided the reconnaissance and communication capabilities that enabled coordinated operations across vast distances. This diversified armada enabled the Brotherhood to project power throughout the eastern seas in ways that would have been impossible for any land-based organization. Their squadrons could appear suddenly off distant coasts, strike at enemy commerce or installations, and withdraw to their island stronghold before local forces could respond effectively. Such mobility transformed the strategic balance throughout the region and established the warriors as a major factor in every political calculation. Economic transformation that accompanied this maritime focus represented one of the most successful examples of institutional adaptation in medieval history. Rather than attempting to recreate the agricultural estates that had supported their operations in the Holy Land, the Brotherhood embraced a fundamentally different economic model based on controlling sea routes and exploiting the commercial opportunities that seafaring dominance provided. The corsair economy that emerged from this new strategic environment operated according to carefully calculated principles that maximized both immediate profits and long-term political objectives. Rather than engaging in random piracy that would have alienated potential allies, the warriors conducted systematic campaigns against Muslim shipping that served broader Christian interests while generating the revenues necessary for maintaining their maritime forces. Captured craft and their cargoes provided immediate income that could be reinvested in shipbuilding, weapons procurement, and crew recruitment. More valuable still were the ransom payments that Muslim merchants and sailors generated, creating steady revenue streams that enabled long-term planning and resource allocation. Most significantly, the intelligence gathered from prisoners and captured documents provided invaluable insights into enemy capabilities, commercial patterns, and political developments throughout the region. Slave markets that operated under Brotherhood supervision on the island became major commercial centers that attracted buyers from throughout the Christian world. These markets operated according to established legal frameworks that regulated prices, ensured humane treatment of captives, and provided mechanisms for negotiating releases. The profits generated by these operations funded everything from ship construction to charitable activities that maintained the warriors' reputation for principled conduct. The Lang system that governed internal organization represented a remarkable innovation in international coordination that enabled effective management of a truly multinational military force. The 8 tongues, Provence, Auvergne, France, Italy, Aragon, England, Germany, and Castile, each contributed specific capabilities while maintaining their distinct cultural identities within the larger organizational framework. Each langue possessed specialized responsibilities that reflected both the particular strengths of their national recruitment base and the diverse requirements of maritime operations. The French contingents, drawing upon extensive experience in regional commerce, managed much of the squadron's logistical operations and financial planning. The Italian warriors, benefiting from the advanced shipbuilding techniques developed in Genoa and Venice, supervised craft construction and maintenance. The Spanish Langs, with their extensive experience in combating Muslim seafaring forces, provided tactical expertise and specialized combat capabilities. The English Lang, though geographically distant from these waters, contributed crucial expertise in artillery and siege techniques that proved invaluable during the major defensive operations that would define this period. The German warriors provided engineering capabilities and metallurgical expertise that enhanced both shipbuilding and weapons production. The diverse backgrounds represented by these national groups created a depth of experience and capability that no single nation could have provided. The auberge system that housed each langue within the island capital created a unique urban environment that functioned simultaneously as a military base, commercial center, and international diplomatic capital. Each national group maintained its own facilities, customs, and internal governance, while participating in the coordinated activities that made the overall organization effective. This arrangement enabled the preservation of diverse traditions, while fostering the cooperation necessary for complex joint operations. Diplomatic immunity establishment that emerged from the Brotherhood's unique international status created precedents that would influence the development of modern international law. As a sovereign entity recognized by the Pope but operating independently of any secular kingdom, the warriors occupied a unique position that required innovative approaches to managing relationships with other powers. Representatives of the Brotherhood enjoyed diplomatic status in courts throughout Europe and the region, enabling them to negotiate agreements, gather intelligence, and coordinate policies with potential allies. This diplomatic network provided early warning of political developments that might affect their interests, while creating opportunities for forming coalitions against common enemies. Treaties negotiated during this period established principles for maritime law, prisoner treatment, and commercial regulation that influenced international relations throughout these waters. The Brotherhood's reputation for honoring agreements made them valuable intermediaries in conflicts between other powers, while their seafaring capabilities gave them leverage in negotiations that purely diplomatic entities lacked. Commercial privileges granted to the warriors by various rulers reflected recognition of their value as allies and trading partners. These agreements provided access to markets, bases, and supply sources that enabled operations far from their island home, while generating additional revenues through legitimate commerce. The combination of official diplomatic recognition and practical military capability created a unique position that enabled the Brotherhood to pursue their objectives through multiple channels simultaneously. Fortification of the island itself represented the culmination of centuries of experience in defensive architecture, adapted to the unique requirements of a citadel that needed to withstand both land and sea assault. The massive walls that rose from the harbors incorporated innovations that reflected lessons learned from every siege the warriors had experienced or observed throughout their history. Harbor defenses that protected the crucial bases demonstrated sophisticated understanding of the specific challenges posed by amphibious assault operations. Underwater obstacles and carefully positioned artillery batteries created overlapping fields of fire that could devastate attacking squadrons while protecting friendly craft entering or leaving port. These defensive systems enabled the Brotherhood to maintain their supremacy even when facing numerically superior enemies. The palace complex that served as the administrative center of this maritime state rivaled the governmental facilities of major European kingdoms. Its archives contained detailed records of operations, commercial transactions, diplomatic correspondence, and intelligence reports that enabled effective coordination of activities across the entire regional basin. The bureaucratic systems developed to manage these complex operations influenced administrative practice throughout Europe. The Grand Master's Court became a center of international diplomacy that attracted representatives from every major power in the region. The wealth generated by seafaring operations, the strategic importance of the island's position, and the military capabilities of the warriors made their alliance valuable to rulers from England to Ethiopia. This diplomatic prominence enhanced the Brotherhood's ability to gather intelligence, negotiate favorable agreements, and coordinate policies with potential allies. Cultural flowering that accompanied this period of prosperity demonstrated how military success could support intellectual and artistic achievement. The warriors patronized scholars, artists, and craftsmen whose work reflected the cosmopolitan character of their maritime empire. The architectural projects undertaken during this period created some of the finest examples of late medieval stronghold design, while the artistic works commissioned for palace decoration incorporated influences from every corner of the regional world. Yet even as their island realm reached unprecedented heights of power and prosperity, ominous developments were emerging that would test every capability the Brotherhood had developed. The rise of Ottoman seafaring power under sultans who possessed both the resources and determination necessary for systematic expansion represented a fundamentally different challenge from any they had previously faced. The innovations pioneered by Ottoman shipbuilders began to challenge the technological advantages that had made the warriors masters of the eastern seas. Larger craft, carrying more powerful artillery, combined with systematically trained crews and coordinated tactics, created capabilities that would eventually force the Brotherhood to reconsider their strategic position. More threatening still was the emergence of Ottoman admirals who understood maritime warfare as thoroughly as the Brotherhood themselves. These commanders had studied the techniques that made the warriors successful and developed counter-strategies specifically designed to neutralize their advantages. The battles that lay ahead would test not just the Brotherhood's courage and skill, but their ability to adapt once again to a changing strategic environment. The first major test came in 1480, when Mehmed II launched a massive assault that represented the most serious threat the island had faced since the warriors' arrival. The siege that followed would demonstrate both the strength of the fortifications the Brotherhood had created and the limitations imposed by their numerical inferiority when facing a determined enemy with superior resources. Pierre d'Aubusson, the Grand Master who led the defense, embodied the evolution of leadership that this period had produced. Unlike his predecessors, who had been primarily land-based warriors, d'Aubusson possessed deep understanding of both seafaring strategy and siege defense, diplomatic finesse and military leadership, commercial calculation and spiritual commitment. His leadership during the 1480 siege would establish principles that would guide the Brotherhood through the challenges ahead. Successful defense against Mehmed's assault provided a temporary respite, but it also revealed the fundamental strategic challenge that would ultimately determine the warriors' fate on their island stronghold. No matter how skillfully they adapted to new circumstances, no matter how effectively they leveraged their maritime capabilities, they remained a small organization facing the growing power of an empire that commanded vastly superior resources and manpower. The stage was set for the final confrontation that would determine whether the seafaring empire the Brotherhood had built could survive the Ottoman expansion that was reshaping the entire eastern region. The innovations in maritime warfare, citadel design, and international diplomacy that had made their island realm a power would soon face their ultimate test against an enemy who had learned to combine traditional siege techniques with the latest advances in artillery and coordination. When Suleiman the Magnificent finally arrived with the largest armada ever assembled against the island's stronghold, the warriors who had mastered the art of maritime dominance would discover whether their innovations in defense could withstand the ultimate test of Ottoman determination and overwhelming force. The age of their seafaring empire was about to face its greatest trial, one that would determine not just their survival, but the future of Christian power in the eastern seas. The Mediterranean sun blazed mercilessly down upon the barren limestone plateau as Philippe Villiers de l'Isle Adam, the last Grand Master of the island empire, surveyed what would become his Brotherhood's final refuge. Malta appeared desolate compared to the verdant hills and prosperous harbours they had abandoned. Yet this rocky outcrop possessed strategic advantages that would prove even more crucial than those they had lost. Charles V of Spain, in his wisdom or calculation, had granted them not just sanctuary, but the key to controlling the central Mediterranean's most vital shipping lanes. The Holy Roman Emperor's gift came with conditions that revealed both the Brotherhood's diminished circumstances and their continuing value as allies against Ottoman expansion. The warriors would hold Malta, Gozo, and the North African fortress of Tripoli in perpetual sovereignty, but they owed Charles an annual tribute of a single Maltese falcon, a symbolic gesture that acknowledged imperial overlordship while preserving the Brotherhood's essential independence. More significantly, they were required to maintain the defense of Tripoli, a commitment that would stretch their resources and expose them to constant pressure from corsairs operating out of the Barbary ports. These obligations reflected the complex realities of 16th century power politics, where even the mightiest emperors required allies capable of projecting force across vast maritime distances. Charles V commanded territories spanning from Peru to the Philippines, yet his scattered dominions remained vulnerable to enemies who could strike from the sea before imperial forces could respond. The displaced warriors, despite their recent defeat, possessed exactly the maritime expertise and institutional resilience that such challenges demanded. Strategic importance of their new home became apparent as soon as the Brotherhood's engineers began surveying the harbours and coastlines. Malta's position, astride the shipping routes connecting the western and eastern basins of the inland sea, meant that any power controlling the island could monitor and influence commerce throughout the region. More crucially, Malta lay directly across the path that Ottoman expeditions would need to follow when striking westward towards Sicily, Naples, or the Spanish mainland. The Grand Harbour, carved deep into the island's limestone heart, provided natural protection for even the largest warships, while offering multiple defensive positions that could be fortified against assault from land or sea. The surrounding heights commanded every approach to the anchorage, creating opportunities for overlapping fields of fire that would make any attack extremely costly. Most remarkably, the harbour's configuration enabled defenders to control access through relatively narrow channels that could be blocked or defended by small numbers of determined troops. Rebuilding efforts began immediately upon the Brotherhood's arrival, driven by the urgent recognition that their survival depended on transforming this rocky refuge into an impregnable bastion before their enemies could organize a systematic assault. Unlike their predecessors who had inherited existing fortifications on their island stronghold, the warriors faced the challenge of creating an entirely new defensive system adapted to the latest developments in siege warfare and artillery technology. The fortress island that emerged from these construction efforts represented the culmination of medieval military architecture, enhanced by Renaissance innovations in artillery placement and geometric design. Italian engineers, working alongside the Brotherhood's own master builders, created interlocking defensive systems that could concentrate devastating firepower against any conceivable attack, while providing secure positions for the defenders, even under the heaviest bombardment. Fort St. Elmo, constructed on the narrow peninsula that commanded the entrance to Grand Harbour, became the keystone of this defensive network. Though relatively small compared to the massive citadels the Brotherhood had built in their previous territories, this star-shaped fortification incorporated every lesson learned from 2 centuries of siege warfare. Its angular bastions, designed according to the latest Italian geometric principles, deflected cannonballs while providing optimal positions for defensive artillery. Underground galleries honeycombed the bedrock beneath the fort, creating secure passages for moving ammunition and troops, while enabling devastating surprise attacks against besiegers. The sophisticated gate systems incorporated multiple drawbridges, murder holes, and overlapping fields of fire that created killing zones where attackers would find themselves trapped under crossfire from multiple directions. Most ingeniously, the fort's design included sally ports hidden within the bastions that allowed small groups of defenders to emerge suddenly behind enemy positions, disrupting assault formations when they were most vulnerable. The engineering challenges involved in constructing these fortifications on solid limestone required innovations that influenced military architecture throughout Europe. Traditional earth and timber defensive works, though easier to build, would have provided inadequate protection against the heavy artillery that Ottoman forces could bring to bear. The solution lay in developing new techniques for quarrying, moving, and precisely fitting enormous stone blocks into defensive walls capable of absorbing tremendous punishment while maintaining their structural integrity. Water supply systems that supported these defensive complexes represented triumphs of engineering that ensured the fortifications could withstand extended sieges even in Malta's arid climate. Elaborate cisterns carved directly into the living rock collected and stored rainwater with such efficiency that the defenders could maintain thousands of troops throughout prolonged campaigns. These water management systems, combined with carefully planned storage facilities for food and ammunition, created the logistical foundations necessary for sustaining major defensive operations. During this period of frantic preparation, a new enemy emerged whose capabilities would test every aspect of the Brotherhood's developing defensive systems. Dragut Pasha, the Ottoman admiral, whose tactical brilliance and intimate knowledge of the region's waters made him the most feared corsair commander of his age, began systematically probing the island's defenses while establishing bases throughout the central Mediterranean that could support larger operations. Dragut's approach to warfare combined the traditional Ottoman emphasis on overwhelming force with innovative tactics specifically designed to exploit the weaknesses of isolated fortress systems. Rather than relying solely on direct assault, he pioneered techniques for disrupting supply lines, corrupting local populations, and coordinating simultaneous attacks from multiple directions that could overwhelm even the most sophisticated defenses. The Corsair admiral's raids against Malta's outlying settlements and shipping demonstrated both his tactical sophistication and the strategic challenge facing the Brotherhood. These attacks served multiple purposes. They gathered intelligence about defensive preparations, tested the responsiveness of the garrison, disrupted economic activities that might support resistance, and established the psychological conditions that would influence behavior during a major siege. More ominously, Dragut's operations revealed the extent to which Ottoman naval power had evolved since the Brotherhood's departure from their former stronghold. The warships under his command incorporated the latest advances in artillery technology, enabling them to engage coastal fortifications on equal terms, while maintaining the mobility advantages that made them so difficult to counter. These vessels could appear suddenly off any section of Malta's coastline, deliver devastating bombardments, and withdraw before defensive forces could respond effectively. Intelligence gathered through these probing operations provided Ottoman planners with detailed knowledge of Malta's defensive capabilities, garrison strength, and logistical vulnerabilities. Dragut's reports to Constantinople described exactly which fortifications posed the greatest threats, which approaches offered the best opportunities for successful assault, and what resources would be required for a campaign designed to eliminate the Brotherhood's presence permanently. The grand strategy that emerged from Ottoman planning sessions reflected sophisticated understanding of the challenges involved in capturing a well-fortified island defended by experienced troops with nowhere to retreat. Rather than attempting a single, overwhelming assault, Ottoman commanders developed a systematic approach that would methodically eliminate defensive positions while maintaining continuous pressure that would exhaust the defenders' resources and morale. When Suleiman the Magnificent finally committed the full resources of his empire to eliminating the Maltese threat in 1565, the force assembled represented the largest military expedition the Ottomans had ever directed against a single target. Over 40,000 troops supported by 180 ships created an armada whose size shocked observers throughout Europe and demonstrated the Sultan's determination to eliminate this obstacle to Ottoman expansion once and for all. The Great Siege that began on May 18th, 1565, would become one of history's most celebrated defensive campaigns, a 4-month struggle that would determine not just the Brotherhood's survival, but the balance of power throughout the Mediterranean world. Jean Parisot de Valette, the Grand Master who led the defense, embodied the martial virtues and strategic vision that 2 centuries of warfare had refined within the Brotherhood's leadership. Valette's approach to the coming siege reflected both the lessons learned from previous defeats and innovations, specifically adapted to Malta's unique defensive opportunities. Rather than attempting to defend every position equally, he concentrated his forces at key points while creating multiple fallback positions that would enable continued resistance, even if major fortifications fell to enemy assault. The opening phases of Ottoman attack focused on Fort Saint Elmo, whose position commanding the harbour entrance made it essential for any successful invasion. The fortress's small garrison, though vastly outnumbered, possessed advantages that would prove crucial throughout the siege. Intimate knowledge of their defensive positions, carefully prepared ammunition supplies, and the unshakable conviction that their survival depended on holding their ground, regardless of the odds. The siege of Fort St. Elmo became a masterpiece of tactical innovation that demonstrated how determined defenders could extract enormous costs from apparently overwhelming attackers. Each dawn brought renewed Ottoman assaults that tested different approaches to breaching the fortress's defenses. Turkish engineers constructed massive earthworks on Mount Siberys, positioning heavy artillery pieces that could fire down into the fort's courtyards. The defenders responded by creating covered walkways and reinforcing vulnerable positions with sandbags and timber, adapting their defensive arrangements daily to counter new threats. The most desperate moment came during the failed Ottoman night assault of June 16th, when Turkish troops managed to plant their banners on the fortress walls before being driven back in savage hand-to-hand combat. Captain Miranda, commanding the garrison, personally led the counterattack that threw the Turks back into the ditch, though he paid for this victory with his life. The psychological impact of this near success sent shockwaves through both armies. The Ottomans, because they had come so close yet failed. The defenders, because they realized how precarious their position had become. Underground warfare reached unprecedented sophistication as both sides dug tunnels and counter-tunnels beneath the fortress. Ottoman miners, following techniques perfected during their siege of Constantinople, attempted to place explosive charges beneath the bastions, while the defenders' counter-mining operations sought to intercept and collapse these tunnels. The sound of picks and shovels echoing through the limestone created an eerie soundtrack to the surface fighting, while sudden explosions marked the success or failure of these subterranean battles. More significantly, the prolonged resistance at St. Elmo disrupted Ottoman strategic planning by consuming time and resources that commanders had intended to concentrate against the main defensive positions. Each day that the small fortress continued fighting was a day that allowed reinforcements to arrive, defensive preparations to be completed, and Ottoman morale to erode under the constant strain of costly attacks. The sacrifice of St. Elmo's garrison, after 31 days of continuous combat, achieved strategic objectives that far exceeded anything its small size might have suggested possible. The 1,500 Ottoman casualties inflicted during the fortress's capture represented losses that could not be easily replaced, while the psychological impact of such determined resistance sent clear messages to both sides about the likely cost of continuing operations. More devastating still was the death of Dragut Pasha himself on June 23rd, killed by a stone fragment when a defensive cannonball struck the rocks near his observation post. The Master Corsair's death demoralized Ottoman forces, while eliminating the one commander who possessed intimate knowledge of Maltese waters and defensive capabilities. His loss forced a complete reorganization of Ottoman naval strategy at the worst possible moment, when coordination between land and sea forces was becoming critical to success. Ottoman commanders who had expected rapid victory found themselves facing opponents whose tactical sophistication and unwavering determination created challenges they had not anticipated. Internal conflicts between Mustafa Pasha, commanding the land forces, and Piali Pasha, leading the naval contingent, undermined operational effectiveness at crucial moments. The two commanders disagreed fundamentally about strategy. Mustafa favored systematic siege operations that would methodically reduce defensive positions, while Piali pressed for rapid assault that would minimize exposure of the fleet to autumn storms. These disputes delayed critical decisions while enabling defenders to strengthen their positions and coordinate with relief forces. Supply line problems that had seemed manageable during the campaign's planning phase became critical weaknesses as the siege extended far beyond expected duration. The Ottoman expedition had been provisioned for a rapid summer campaign, not a prolonged siege extending into autumn. Food shortages led to reduced rations that weakened troops already exhausted by constant fighting, while ammunition consumption exceeded projections by enormous margins. Disease began spreading through the overcrowded camps as sanitation systems broke down under the strain of maintaining so many troops in confined spaces for extended periods. The main assault against the fortified positions around Grand Harbour demonstrated both the strengths and limitations of Ottoman siege techniques when applied against properly prepared defences held by experienced troops. The massive bombardments that had proved effective against other fortifications failed to create practical breaches in walls specifically designed to absorb and deflect artillery fire. Ottoman engineers constructed the famous Great Ramp, an enormous earthwork that enabled their artillery to fire directly into the post of Castile's courtyard. But even this engineering marvel failed to provide the decisive advantage that commanders had anticipated. Innovative mining operations conducted by both sides created an underground battlefield that paralleled the surface fighting. Ottoman miners, working in shifts around the clock, dug tunnels toward the foundations of crucial bastions, while defenders countered with their own galleries, designed to intercept and destroy these efforts. The explosion that marked the collapse of a major Ottoman tunnel on August 18th could be heard across the entire island, while the subsequent collapse killed dozens of Turkish miners and demoralized those who survived. Artillery innovations developed during the siege influenced weapons design throughout Europe. The Ottoman guns firing from Mount Siberys included some of the largest siege pieces ever constructed, capable of hurling stone balls weighing over 300 pounds across the harbour with devastating effect. The defenders responded by developing new techniques for rapid cannon repair and replacement, while their counter-battery fire demonstrated how properly positioned defensive artillery could neutralize even the heaviest siege guns. Engineering techniques developed by the Brotherhood's master builders enabled rapid repair of damage while maintaining the structural integrity of critical defensive positions. Specialized crews working under cover of darkness could rebuild damaged sections faster than Ottoman artillery could destroy them, creating a strategic stalemate that favored defenders operating from secure bases with carefully managed supply lines. The chain stratagem that protected Grand Harbor entrance represented one of the siege's most innovative defensive measures. This massive iron barrier, stretching across the harbor mouth, prevented Ottoman ships from entering the anchorage, while creating opportunities for devastating attacks against vessels attempting to force passage. The psychological impact of this obstacle proved as important as its physical effectiveness, demonstrating the defenders' capacity for creative problem-solving under extreme pressure. Spanish relief preparations that began mobilizing throughout the Western Mediterranean created the strategic context that would ultimately determine the siege's outcome. Don Garcia de Toledo, the Spanish viceroy responsible for coordinating relief efforts, faced the complex challenge of assembling sufficient forces to break the Ottoman siege while ensuring that other Spanish territories remained adequately defended against possible diversionary attacks. His solution involved gathering an 8,000-man relief army composed of Spanish veterans from the Italian wars, Neapolitan troops experienced in amphibious operations, and Sicilian militia familiar with local conditions. The march across Sicily demonstrated the logistical sophistication that enabled Spanish intervention at the optimal moment. Coordinating the movement of such a large force across the island required careful planning of supply depots, medical facilities, and transportation arrangements that tested every aspect of Spanish administrative capability. Most challenging was maintaining operational security while assembling such obvious preparations. Ottoman spies were known to operate throughout Sicily, making it essential to disguise the relief force's true size and intentions until the last possible moment. Coordination with Maltese forces required unprecedented levels of communication between besieged defenders and approaching relief columns. Messenger boats, operating under cover of darkness, carried detailed intelligence about Ottoman positions, defensive capabilities, and optimal landing sites that would enable the relief force to achieve maximum tactical surprise. These communications also enabled defenders to time their operations for maximum coordination with the approaching Spanish intervention. Throughout the siege, the Maltese civilian population played crucial roles that proved as important as the professional soldiers' contributions. Women and children worked continuously to maintain supply lines, repair fortifications, and care for wounded defenders. The famous incident of the Maltese women, who carried stones under enemy fire to repair breached walls, demonstrated the depth of popular commitment to resistance. Local militia, though lacking the professional training of the Brotherhood's troops, possessed intimate knowledge of the island's terrain that proved invaluable for night raids, reconnaissance missions, and the harassment of Ottoman supply lines. Resource management during the 4-month siege tested every aspect of the defenders' organizational capabilities. Water rationing systems ensured that the elaborate cisterns could supply the garrison throughout the extended siege, while food distribution networks maximized the nutritional value of limited supplies. Ammunition conservation became a crucial skill as defenders learned to make every shot count, while maintaining sufficient reserves for the climactic battles that everyone knew would determine the siege's ultimate outcome. The diplomatic dimensions of the siege extended far beyond the immediate military confrontation, influencing political relationships throughout Europe. Papal involvement included not just spiritual support, but practical assistance in the form of funds, supplies, and diplomatic pressure on Christian rulers to provide material aid. French neutrality, maintained despite their traditional alliance with the Ottomans, reflected the complex calculations that prevented European powers from fully committing to either side. The siege's outcome would influence Habsburg-Ottoman relations for decades, while demonstrating the continuing relevance of religious considerations in an age increasingly dominated by secular political calculations. Relief force coordination required unprecedented levels of cooperation between Spanish regular forces, Italian mercenaries, Maltese militia, and the Brotherhood's own troops scattered across various defensive positions. These diverse elements needed to function as a unified force capable of breaking through Ottoman siege lines while maintaining sufficient cohesion to exploit any tactical advantages that successful relief might create. The arrival of the Spanish relief force in September 1565 occurred at the precisely optimal moment when Ottoman morale had been exhausted by months of costly attacks, while their supply lines had been stretched to the breaking point by extended operations far from their bases. The psychological impact of seeing fresh troops advancing against their rear positions proved as devastating to Ottoman commanders as the immediate military threat. Ottoman strategic miscalculation that led to the siege's ultimate failure reflected overconfidence born from previous successes rather than any fundamental weakness in their military capabilities. Commanders who had grown accustomed to rapid victories against less determined opponents failed to appreciate the specific challenges posed by attacking a well-prepared island fortress defended by troops with centuries of siege experience. The withdrawal of Ottoman forces in September 1565 marked more than just the failure of a single campaign. It represented the first major check to Ottoman expansion in the Mediterranean and demonstrated that properly organized Christian resistance could successfully challenge even the empire's most determined efforts. The final casualty figures revealed the staggering cost of the failed siege: over 30,000 Ottoman dead, compared to approximately 7,000 Christian losses, including civilians. These numbers reflected not just the tactical advantages of defensive fighting, but the strategic miscalculations that had led Ottoman commanders to persist with operations long after their initial objectives had become unattainable. Prisoner exchanges conducted in the siege's aftermath provided both sides with valuable intelligence about enemy capabilities, while demonstrating the complex codes of honor that governed warfare even between implacable religious enemies. The liberation of several hundred Christian galley slaves represented a significant moral victory for the defenders, while the ransoming of high-ranking Ottoman captives provided revenues that would support Malta's reconstruction efforts. Immediate fortification repairs began before the last Ottoman ships had disappeared beyond the horizon, as engineers worked frantically to strengthen defensive positions that might soon face renewed attack. The lessons learned during the siege influenced every aspect of these reconstruction efforts, from improved artillery positions to enhanced underground communication systems that would enable more effective coordination during future operations. Victory at Malta established the Brotherhood's reputation as the premier defensive specialists of their age, while providing them with the resources and prestige necessary for the next phase of their institutional development. The island that had seemed like exile when they first arrived had proven to be the foundation for achievements that surpassed even their former glory. European recognition of their achievement brought both material support and diplomatic advantages that would enable the Brotherhood to rebuild their strength while maintaining their independence despite the changed political environment of the late Renaissance. The warriors, who had seemed destined for gradual decline, had instead demonstrated their continuing relevance in an age of gunpowder and global politics. The lessons learned during the Great Siege would influence military thinking throughout Europe, while establishing tactical principles that would guide fortress design and siege operations for centuries to come. The Brotherhood's synthesis of traditional martial virtues with innovative defensive techniques had created a model that would inspire resistance movements facing seemingly overwhelming odds throughout the early modern period. As the smoke cleared from Malta's battered fortifications and the last Ottoman ships disappeared beyond the horizon, the Brotherhood faced the challenge of consolidating their victory while preparing for the responsibilities that success had thrust upon them. The age of their greatest trials was ending, but the era of their ultimate transformation was about to begin. Victory's morning dawned over a transformed world. As smoke cleared from Malta's battered fortifications and the last Ottoman vessels disappeared beyond the horizon, Jean de Valette stood among the rubble of what had been Fort Saint Elmo and envisioned something that would surpass even the glorious strongholds his predecessors had built. A new capital would rise from these limestone cliffs, bearing his name and becoming the most magnificent fortress city in Europe. A monument to their triumph and a declaration that this island state had achieved permanent legitimacy among the powers of the world. Francesco Laparelli arrived from Rome with revolutionary ideas that would transform bare rock into a masterpiece of Renaissance urban planning. This brilliant Italian architect created designs that combined the latest advances in military engineering with unprecedented elegance in civic construction. His geometric street plan, with perfectly straight roads meeting at precise angles, reflected the mathematical principles that were revolutionizing both warfare and art throughout 16th century Europe. Working alongside Laparelli, Girolamo Casar developed the distinctive vocabulary that would define the new city's unique character. Honey-colored limestone from the very quarries that had provided defensive positions during the Great Siege became the foundation of unprecedented beauty. Casar's genius lay in creating structures that served simultaneously as private residences, governmental facilities, and protective positions. Buildings that could house ambassadors during peacetime and withstand artillery bombardment during war. 8 magnificent hostels rose throughout the capital's districts, each representing one of the national contingents that had defended Malta's walls. These auberges became embassies, headquarters, and cultural centers simultaneously, creating a unique urban environment where international politics operated within the framework of a unified state. Each national group, Provence, Auvergne, France, Italy, Aragon, England, Germany, and Castile, constructed residences that reflected their distinctive traditions while contributing to the city's overall magnificence. Rising above the capital's highest point like a Baroque palace, the Auberge de Castille concealed sophisticated protective features behind its elegant facade. Windows that dazzled visitors with their artistic beauty could be rapidly converted into firing positions, while ornate staircases provided secure routes for moving troops between different levels during siege conditions. Magnificent reception halls hosted political receptions that impressed visiting ambassadors while demonstrating the wealth and cultural sophistication that success had enabled. Perhaps the most elegant of these national residences, the Auberge de France, reflected the refined tastes of aristocrats who had transformed warrior austerity into courtly magnificence. Its library contained one of Europe's finest collections of military treatises, political correspondence, and classical literature, while its armory displayed weapons that combined deadly efficiency with artistic excellence. State banquets for hundreds of guests could be accommodated in its dining hall, yet rapid conversion into a command center remained possible should necessities require such transformation. International recognition as an independent entity under law represented the order's most significant political achievement, establishing precedents that would influence practice for centuries. When European powers gathered to sign the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, they explicitly acknowledged the ruler of Malta's status as a prince equal to the heads of major kingdoms, despite commanding territory that could be traversed on foot in a single day. This recognition reflected not just their military achievements, but their unique position as an international organization that transcended traditional concepts of nationality and territorial control. Special immunity enjoyed by their representatives created opportunities for intelligence gathering and political influence that extended far beyond what their modest territorial base might suggest possible. Permanent ambassadors operated in every major European capital, while their network of commanderies throughout the continent provided channels for confidential communication that bypassed normal political constraints. This network enabled them to mediate conflicts between major powers while advancing their own interests through careful alliance management. Latin fluency requirements that governed advancement within their hierarchy ensured that this ancient language remained their working tongue, while creating intellectual standards that influenced educational practice throughout Catholic Europe. Candidates for senior positions needed to demonstrate mastery of classical Latin, knowledge of canon law, familiarity with engineering, and competence in at least one modern European language. These requirements created a leadership class whose intellectual capabilities matched their martial prowess, while maintaining the international character that had always distinguished them from purely national organizations. Commercial enterprises flourishing under their protection transformed Malta from a barren refuge into one of the region's most prosperous trading centers. Cotton cultivation that they carefully developed became the foundation of 18th century wealth that funded building projects rivaling those of major European capitals. Maltese cotton, prized throughout Europe for its exceptional quality, commanded premium prices that generated steady revenues while creating employment for thousands of islanders whose prosperity depended entirely on their continued success. Banking operations evolving from these commercial activities established financial networks that enabled international transactions on unprecedented scales. Merchants operating under their protection could transfer funds between London and Constantinople, between Venice and Alexandria, using credit instruments that were honored throughout the known world. These financial innovations contributed to the commercial revolution that was transforming European economic life, while providing revenues that exceeded those of many kingdoms. Workshops established within the new capital produced luxury goods that competed with the finest products of Venetian and Florentine craftsmen. Goldsmiths working under patronage created ceremonial weapons whose artistic excellence matched their practical effectiveness, while armor makers developed protective equipment that combined Renaissance aesthetics with the latest advances in metallurgical science. Master craftsmen from throughout Europe found in Malta opportunities for creative expression that secular rulers rarely provided. Political activities conducted by their representatives demonstrated sophisticated understanding of European affairs that enabled them to maintain independence despite their precarious position between competing major powers. Successive rulers cultivated relationships with both Habsburg and Bourbon courts, with both papal and Protestant authorities, maintaining a careful neutrality that preserved their freedom of action while securing material support from multiple sources. This balance required constant attention and extraordinary skill, as any perceived favoritism toward one faction could trigger retaliation from their opponents. Cultural patronage, characterizing this golden age, produced artistic achievements that enhanced their prestige throughout the civilized world. Palace complexes serving as their rulers' residence became showcases of Baroque magnificence that attracted visitors from every corner of Europe. State apartments, decorated with frescoes depicting their greatest victories, provided settings for receptions that reinforced messages about their continuing capabilities, while demonstrating the refinement that distinguished them from mere mercenary organizations. Caravaggio's dramatic arrival in 1608 illustrated both their cultural sophistication and their ability to navigate complex political situations with characteristic pragmatism. When the great painter fled Rome after killing a man during a tennis match, Alof de Wignacourt provided sanctuary that enabled Caravaggio to continue his artistic work while avoiding papal justice. Masterpieces created during his Maltese exile, including his haunting portrait of de Wignacourt and his monumental beheading of St. John the Baptist, enhanced their cultural reputation while demonstrating their willingness to protect artistic genius regardless of personal moral failings. Corsair operations continuing throughout this period represented the evolution of medieval crusading ideals into early modern commercial warfare, rather than engaging in random piracy that would have alienated potential allies. They conducted systematic campaigns against Muslim shipping that served broader Christian interests while generating substantial revenues. These operations required sophisticated intelligence networks, careful coordination, and advanced technologies that maintained their reputation as the sea's premier maritime force. Squadron innovations pioneered under their command influenced strategy throughout Europe. Their vessels combined traditional designs with Atlantic innovations, creating ships capable of both sustained ocean voyages and the rapid maneuvers required for effective corsair operations. Integration of artillery, boarding capabilities, and reconnaissance functions produced platforms that could engage any conceivable enemy while maintaining the flexibility necessary for diverse mission requirements. Prize courts established in their capital operated according to legal frameworks that balanced their commercial interests with the necessities of maintaining relationships with neutral powers. These tribunals developed precedents for maritime law that influenced international legal practice, while ensuring that captured vessels and cargoes were distributed according to principles that maintained organizational unity and individual motivation. Profits generated by these operations funded everything from fortress maintenance to charitable activities that preserved their reputation for principled conduct. Internal tensions emerging during the 17th century reflected the challenges of maintaining medieval institutions within the changing political environment of early modern Europe. Conflicts between different national contingents created administrative difficulties while undermining the unity that had traditionally been their greatest strength. French dominance, reflecting their kingdom's emergence as Europe's leading power, generated resentment among other groups who feared the loss of their traditional autonomy within the organizational structure. Reform movements that periodically emerged attempted to address these tensions while adapting traditional practices to contemporary requirements. Proposals for restructuring the national system, modifying recruitment procedures, and updating tactical doctrines reflected recognition that survival required constant evolution rather than rigid adherence to historical precedents. However, implementing such changes proved difficult when they threatened established interests or challenged cherished traditions that defined their distinctive identity. Gradual decline in relevance that characterized the 18th century resulted from fundamental changes in warfare technology and strategic thinking that reduced the importance of fortress-based strategies. Professional armies equipped with standardized artillery made traditional siege warfare obsolete, while the emergence of global maritime empires shifted strategic attention away from regional concerns toward Atlantic and Pacific theaters. These developments forced them to reconsider their role in a world where their traditional capabilities no longer provided decisive advantages. Efforts to maintain effectiveness included attempts to modernize equipment, training, and tactical procedures according to contemporary standards. Their engineers studied the latest developments in fortification design, while naval experts investigated innovations in ship construction and gunnery techniques. However, these modernization efforts faced fundamental constraints imposed by limited resources and the continuing requirements of maintaining their traditional commitments to healing activities and representation. Focus shifting towards ceremonial tradition during the later 18th century reflected realistic assessment of their capabilities within the changing international environment. Rather than attempting to compete with major powers in areas where they possessed no comparative advantages, successive rulers emphasized their unique position as neutral mediators who could facilitate negotiations between hostile parties. This specialization enabled them to maintain international relevance while preserving the institutional independence that had always been their most precious asset. Ceremonial innovations developed during this period enhanced their prestige, while creating opportunities for demonstrating their continuing significance to European political life. State visits by foreign dignitaries became elaborate productions that showcased the capital's magnificence, while reinforcing messages about their wealth, sophistication, and international connections. These ceremonies required careful choreography that balanced traditional protocols with contemporary expectations, creating memorable experiences that enhanced relationships while advancing practical political objectives. Economic foundations supporting these ceremonial activities demonstrated how successfully they had adapted their traditional resource management capabilities to the requirements of early modern statecraft. Agricultural productivity on Malta and Gozo increased through systematic application of improved farming techniques, while commercial operations expanded to include trade relationships with partners throughout the region and beyond. These economic activities generated sufficient revenues to maintain the lifestyle appropriate for a royal court, while funding the charitable works that preserved their spiritual legitimacy. Educational institutions established during this period contributed to European intellectual life, while training future generations of leaders who would maintain their traditions amid continuing change. The University of Malta, founded under their patronage, attracted scholars from throughout Catholic Europe who found in this island environment opportunities for research and teaching that secular institutions rarely provided. Its library became a major repository of historical documents, scientific treatises, and literary works that enhanced Malta's reputation as a center of learning. Medical innovations pioneered by their physicians influenced practice throughout Europe while maintaining their traditional commitment to healing the sick and poor. The sacred infirmary constructed in their capital became a model for hospital design that combined the latest advances in medical knowledge with features that promoted healing while maintaining institutional efficiency. Foreign medical students traveled to Malta to study techniques that had been refined through centuries of practical experience treating combat injuries and tropical diseases. As the 18th century drew toward its close, they faced challenges that would test every capability developed over 7 centuries of institutional evolution. Intellectual ferment of the Enlightenment questioned traditional religious authority, while political upheavals that would soon transform Europe threatened the stable international framework that had enabled their survival as an independent entity. Revolutionary ideologies emerging from intellectual circles throughout Europe posed fundamental challenges to organizations whose legitimacy rested on traditional concepts of religious mission and aristocratic privilege. Their international character and conservative political orientation made them natural targets for criticism from thinkers who advocated democratic governance, secular authority, and national self-determination. These intellectual attacks preceded the physical threats that would soon emerge from the political chaos engulfing the continent. Approaching crisis would test whether the capabilities that had enabled them to defeat Ottoman expansion, the skills that had preserved their independence among competing European powers, and the expertise that had created their prosperous state, could adapt to forces that challenged the very foundations of the world they had helped to create. Their golden age was approaching its end, but the institutions they had built and the precedents they had established would influence the development of international law, practice, and humanitarian organization long after their territorial independence had become merely a historical memory. These former caregivers for sick pilgrims were about to face their ultimate test of adaptability in a world being transformed by revolution and war. Orthodox assumption of leadership created theological and political problems that threatened to split the community permanently. Catholic warriors who had devoted their lives to serving papal authority found themselves faced with the choice between accepting heretical leadership or abandoning all hope of restoration. The absurdity of an Orthodox autocrat ruling a Catholic organization demonstrated how completely revolutionary upheavals had disrupted traditional patterns of authority and legitimacy. Paul's intervention attracted support from desperate men who saw Russian military power as their only hope for recovering their homeland. Count Giulio Lita, representing the Tsar's interests in Rome, distributed Russian decorations and titles to community members willing to acknowledge Paul's authority. These Orthodox honors came with substantial financial support that enabled recipients to maintain aristocratic lifestyles during their exile, creating powerful incentives for abandoning traditional allegiances. The Catholic faction, led by Tommaso de Tomasis, steadfastly refused to recognize any authority except that of legitimate papal appointment. De Tomasis argued that accepting Orthodox leadership would constitute apostasy and destroy the spiritual foundations that had sustained their mission for 7 centuries. His supporters included many of the most respected senior members who preferred poverty and uncertainty to the spiritual compromise that Russian gold represented. This schism created parallel organizations that competed for recognition from European courts and struggled over control of the community's remaining assets. The Orthodox faction, supported by Russian diplomatic pressure, gained recognition from several German courts that valued Paul's support in their ongoing conflicts with revolutionary powers. Meanwhile, the Catholic faction maintained support from the Vatican and from traditionalist elements throughout Catholic Europe, who viewed the Orthodox connection as a dangerous precedent. Dawn broke over the Mediterranean on June 9th, 1798, revealing a sight that would have been unimaginable just days earlier. Napoleon Bonaparte's massive invasion fleet stretched across the horizon like a floating city, its 400 ships carrying 55,000 troops toward Malta's ancient harbors. From the battlements of Valletta, Ferdinand von Hompesch zu Bolheim watched his world approaching its end with the methodical precision that had made French arms irresistible across half of Europe. Napoleon's expedition represented far more than a simple conquest. It marked the collision between the old world of aristocratic privilege and the new age of democratic revolution. For 7 centuries, the warriors of Malta had adapted to changing circumstances while preserving their essential character. But the forces now approaching their shores embodied principles that challenged the very foundations of their existence. Religious orders, hereditary nobility, and international privilege had become obstacles to revolutionary progress that must be swept aside by the march of history. Hompesch faced an impossible situation that no amount of courage or tactical brilliance could resolve. His garrison numbered barely 332 knights, supported by perhaps 2,000 local militia, while Napoleon commanded veteran troops fresh from victories in Italy and equipped with the finest artillery in Europe. More devastating still was the psychological transformation that had already undermined resistance before the first shot was fired. Many younger knights had absorbed Enlightenment ideas that made them question whether their ancient institution deserved to survive in its traditional form. French revolutionary propaganda that preceded the invasion had systematically undermined loyalty among the very populations whose support would be essential for effective resistance. Proclamations promising liberation from feudal oppression, equality before the law, and an end to religious tyranny found receptive audiences among Maltese civilians who had grown weary of bearing the costs of maintaining an increasingly irrelevant warrior aristocracy. When revolution offered immediate material benefits in exchange for abandoning traditional loyalties, many chose pragmatic calculation over sentimental attachment. Intelligence networks that Napoleon's agents had established throughout the island provided detailed information about defensive capabilities, garrison strength, and political divisions that would determine the campaign's outcome. These operatives had spent months identifying potential collaborators, mapping fortress vulnerabilities, and preparing the psychological groundwork that would make resistance seem futile. By the time French ships appeared on the horizon, the conquest had already been half completed through espionage and propaganda. Within the council chambers of Valletta, bitter debates raged over whether resistance or submission offered the better path forward. Older knights who remembered the glory days of corsair warfare insisted that honor demanded fighting to the death, regardless of the odds. Younger members, influenced by revolutionary ideals, argued that clinging to medieval privileges would only bring unnecessary destruction upon innocent civilians. Between these extremes, pragmatists calculated whether the order could somehow preserve its essential mission while accommodating the political realities of the revolutionary age. Hompesch himself embodied the tragic contradictions that paralyzed effective decision-making during this crisis. Elected as a reformer who might modernize the institution, he lacked both the charismatic authority necessary for inspiring heroic resistance and the revolutionary vision required for embracing fundamental change. His Germanic background made him suspect to French and Italian knights who questioned his commitment to their traditions, while his aristocratic instincts prevented him from understanding the democratic forces that were reshaping European civilization. When French envoys arrived under flags of truce demanding surrender, they carried terms that revealed Napoleon's sophisticated understanding of both the order's weaknesses and their continuing potential value. Rather than simply demanding unconditional capitulation, the French offered to preserve the institution's charitable functions while eliminating its political independence and territorial sovereignty. Knights could continue their hospital work under French supervision, but their role as an autonomous power would end forever. Negotiations that followed demonstrated how completely the balance of power had shifted since the Great Siege of 1565, where Suleiman the Magnificent had been forced to withdraw after months of costly fighting. Napoleon achieved surrender through a combination of overwhelming force and political manipulation that made resistance seem both futile and morally questionable. The psychological warfare that accompanied these negotiations proved as devastating as any artillery bombardment. Opposition to surrender emerged primarily from the older knights who had dedicated their lives to preserving traditions that stretched back to Gerard's original hospital in Jerusalem. These men understood that accepting French terms would transform their order from an independent institution into a subordinate charity, eliminating the sovereignty that had enabled their unique role in European politics. However, their protests carried little weight against the practical arguments of those who recognized that symbolic gestures could not overcome material realities. June 12, 1798, witnessed one of history's most anticlimactic endings to a great military tradition. After token resistance that lasted barely 3 days, Hompesh ordered the surrender that opened Malta's gates to French occupation. The contrast with their ancestors' heroic defense against Ottoman invasion could not have been more stark. Where previous generations had chosen glorious death over dishonored survival, this generation chose pragmatic accommodation over meaningful resistance. French occupation that followed revealed both Napoleon's administrative genius and his complete misunderstanding of the energies that had sustained the community's effectiveness for so many centuries. Revolutionary officials who took control of the island's government implemented reforms that eliminated feudal privileges, redistributed property, and established secular institutions modeled on Parisian practice. These changes brought immediate material benefits to many Maltese civilians, while systematically destroying the social foundations that had supported the warrior's traditional role. However, Bonaparte's agents had fundamentally miscalculated the depth of Maltese Catholic devotion and attachment to their traditional protectors. Within months of the occupation, restrictions on religious practice, confiscation of church property, and systematic looting of sacred artifacts generated a popular resentment that would soon explode into open rebellion. Canon Francesco Saverio Caruana emerged as the unlikely leader of this resistance movement, transforming parish networks into cells of organized opposition that coordinated sabotage efforts across the entire island. The Maltese uprising that began in September 1798 caught Bonaparte's administrators completely off guard. Emanuele Vitale, a notary from Medina, coordinated communications between rebel groups while organizing supply networks that enabled sustained guerrilla warfare against the occupying army. This popular revolt demonstrated that revolutionary ideals, however attractive in theory, could not overcome deeply rooted religious and cultural loyalties when imposed by foreign conquerors. Rural populations who had seemed passive during the initial invasion revealed sophisticated understanding of guerrilla tactics that made effective occupation impossible. Rebel groups attacked isolated garrisons, disrupted supply convoys, and eliminated collaborators with ruthless efficiency. French administrators found themselves besieged within their urban strongholds, while the countryside remained under rebel control. This insurgency provided crucial support for British naval operations, while demonstrating the continuing power of traditional loyalties in an age of revolutionary change. Systematic looting of the community's accumulated treasures provided Bonaparte's expedition with resources that partially funded his subsequent Egyptian campaign. The famous inventory compiled by French officials documented an astounding collection: 12 solid gold dinner services, ceremonial swords encrusted with precious gems, silver altarpieces weighing several tons, and a library containing over 80,000 volumes, including irreplaceable medieval manuscripts. The total value exceeded 7 million francs, enough to finance an entire army for months. Specific items that disappeared into revolutionary wagons told the story of 7 centuries of accumulated glory. The Grand Master's ceremonial armor, crafted by the finest Renaissance artisans, was melted down for its precious metals. Ancient battle standards that had flown over victorious ramparts were cut up for their gold thread. Most heartbreaking of all, illuminated manuscripts documenting their early history in Jerusalem were bundled as packing material for more obviously valuable plunder. Yet Bonaparte's agents missed the most significant treasure of all. Working through the night before the surrender, loyal knights and Maltese servants succeeded in hiding substantial portions of their archives and sacred relics in secret chambers carved deep into Malta's limestone bedrock. These hidden collections would prove crucial for later restoration efforts, preserving both the legal documents necessary for maintaining their claims to sovereignty and the spiritual artifacts that embodied their religious mission. British promises of restoration, initially sincere, gradually gave way to strategic calculations that made permanent occupation inevitable. Lord Horatio Nelson's dispatches from 1799 reveal his growing conviction that Malta's strategic value far outweighed any sentimental obligations to restore an obsolete military hierarchy. "Malta is, in my opinion, a most important outwork to India," he wrote to the Admiralty, "and I hope we shall never give it up." More devastating than financial losses was the psychological impact of witnessing their sacred traditions reduced to mere plunder for revolutionary armies. Knights who had devoted their lives to preserving their institution's heritage watched helplessly as French soldiers treated priceless relics as common booty. The humiliation of seeing their ceremonial weapons melted down for their metal content, and their historical documents used as packing material, created wounds that would never fully heal. Expulsion from Malta scattered the Order's membership across a Europe increasingly hostile to traditional institutions. Individual knights sought refuge wherever they could find it, many returning to their countries of origin, only to discover that revolutionary upheavals had eliminated the social structures that might have supported them. Some attempted to maintain their religious commitments through individual charity work, while others simply abandoned their vows and attempted to build new lives as private citizens. Individual stories of survival during the exile period illustrated both the personal costs of institutional collapse and the remarkable resilience that enabled eventual restoration. Chevalier François de Bosredon, forced to flee Malta with only the clothes on his back, spent years working as a tutor for aristocratic families in Austrian territories. His fluency in multiple languages and expertise in military engineering enabled him to support himself while maintaining contact with other displaced members through clandestine correspondence networks. Count Alessandro Cagliostro, despite his advanced age, undertook the dangerous journey to Russian territories, where he hoped to serve under Paul's patronage. The harsh winter journey proved too much for his constitution, and he died in a roadside inn near Warsaw, surrounded by strangers who had no knowledge of his distinguished service during the Great Siege. His death symbolized the fate of many older members who could not adapt to the dramatic changes that exile required. More fortunate was bailiff Jean-Baptiste de Flaxlanden, whose family connections in Alsace enabled him to secure a position with the Austrian diplomatic service. His knowledge of Mediterranean affairs proved valuable during the complex negotiations that followed Bonaparte's defeats, and he eventually played a crucial role in the restoration efforts of the 1820s. His survival demonstrated how those with adaptable skills and political connections could transform institutional catastrophe into personal opportunity. The commanderies scattered throughout Europe faced systematic suppression that eliminated the economic foundations of traditional support. Revolutionary governments in France confiscated all properties, distributing estates to political supporters, while converting religious buildings to secular purposes. The Grand Priory of France alone lost properties worth over 12 million livres, eliminating the primary source of revenue that had supported activities in the Mediterranean for centuries. Similar confiscations occurred throughout German territories as Napoleon's influence expanded. The Grand Priory of Germany, with its extensive holdings in Bavaria and the Rhineland, disappeared entirely when local rulers chose to support Bonaparte, rather than honor their traditional obligations to a displaced religious hierarchy. These losses eliminated not just immediate income, but the hereditary relationships with noble families that had provided political support for centuries. Bartolomeo Ruspoli emerged as one of the most determined advocates for restoration, operating from Sicily, where he attempted to coordinate resistance efforts while maintaining the order's legal claims to independence. His efforts demonstrated both the persistence of institutional loyalty and the practical difficulties of organizing effective opposition to French occupation. Without territorial base, financial resources, or political support from major powers, such restoration attempts remained largely symbolic gestures rather than serious threats to revolutionary control. Meanwhile, Napoleon's strategic miscalculation in maintaining control of Malta became apparent as British naval forces began systematic efforts to reclaim the island for their own purposes. Admiral Horatio Nelson understood that controlling Malta's harbours would provide decisive advantages in the Mediterranean campaign against French expansion. However, British motivations had nothing to do with restoring the Order's independence. They sought to add Malta to their growing empire as a strategic naval base. British siege operations that began in 1798 created a complex three-way struggle that further complicated the Order's position. While many knights hoped that British victory might lead to their restoration, others recognized that exchanging French occupation for British control would simply substitute one form of foreign domination for another. The bitter irony was that their island fortress, built to serve as the bastion of Christendom against Ottoman expansion, had become a prize in conflicts between Christian powers. 2 years of fighting between British and French forces devastated Malta's civilian population, while demonstrating the island's continuing strategic importance in Mediterranean warfare. The siege techniques employed by both sides incorporated innovations developed since the Order's great defense against Ottoman attack. Yet the defenders now fought not for religious principles or institutional survival, but for the political objectives of secular nation-states. British victory in 1800 established control over Malta that would endure for the next century and a half, but it also eliminated any realistic possibility of restoring the Order's territorial independence. While some British politicians initially considered returning Malta to the Knights as a gesture of respect for traditional authority, strategic considerations ultimately prevailed over sentimental attachments. Malta's harbours were too valuable to be entrusted to an institution that lacked the resources necessary for effective defence against modern enemies. Treaties signed at various points during this period reflected the complexity of legal questions surrounding the Order's status as a displaced sovereign entity. The Treaty of Amiens in 1802 included provisions for the Order's restoration that demonstrated continuing recognition of their legal rights. Yet these clauses proved meaningless when more pressing political considerations intervened. The gap between theoretical acknowledgement and practical implementation revealed how completely the international system had been transformed by revolutionary upheavals. Paul I of Russia's dramatic intervention in 1798 created one of the most bizarre episodes in the Order's long history. Upon learning of Hompesch's surrender, the Russian Tsar declared himself Grand Master and announced his intention to restore the institution's military effectiveness through Orthodox rather than Catholic auspices. This unprecedented action reflected both Paul's romantic attachment to medieval chivalric ideals and his strategic interest in challenging French expansion in the Mediterranean. Orthodox assumption of leadership created theological and political problems that threatened to split the Order permanently. Catholic knights who had devoted their lives to serving papal authority found themselves faced with the choice between accepting heretical leadership or abandoning all hope of institutional restoration. The absurdity of an Orthodox autocrat ruling a Catholic military order demonstrated how completely revolutionary upheavals had disrupted traditional patterns of authority and legitimacy. Paul's assassination in 1801 ended this strange experiment, but not before it had created lasting divisions within the Order's remnant membership. Some knights had enthusiastically embraced Russian patronage as their best hope for revival, while others had steadfastly refused to acknowledge any authority except that of legitimate Catholic leadership. These divisions would complicate subsequent efforts at reunification long after the immediate crisis had passed. European diplomatic conferences that followed Napoleon's final defeat addressed the Order's status as part of broader efforts to restore stability after decades of revolutionary warfare. The Congress of Vienna in 1815 included discussions about territorial compensation that might enable the Order's restoration as an independent entity. Yet these negotiations ultimately produced nothing more than vague expressions of sympathy for their unfortunate circumstances. Various schemes proposed during these negotiations revealed both the continuing recognition of the community's historical importance and the practical impossibility of recreating their former position within the transformed European system. The Ionian Islands proposal, strongly supported by British Foreign Secretary Lord Castlereagh, would have granted them sovereignty over Corfu and its satellite territories. This plan foundered when Russian opposition made it clear that creating a British protected state in such strategically sensitive waters would trigger broader conflicts. Alternative suggestions for German territories reflected Austrian Foreign Minister Metternich's desire to strengthen traditional institutions as bulwarks against revolutionary ideologies. The Duchy of Würzburg, recently secularized and available for redistribution, might have provided an adequate territorial base for restoration. However, Bavarian claims to these lands, supported by their crucial alliance with Austria during the anti-Bonaparte campaigns, ultimately prevailed over sentimental attachments to medieval chivalry. Colonial compensation schemes represented the most creative attempts to resolve the community's territorial needs, while serving broader European interests. The British government seriously considered granting them Trinidad, or one of the other recently acquired Caribbean islands, where they might have recreated their traditional role as maritime defenders of Christendom against new enemies. This proposal attracted support from those who recognized that the community's naval expertise might prove valuable in protecting commercial interests against piracy and foreign competition. The fundamental obstacle to all restoration schemes lay in the transformation of European political culture that had eliminated the social foundations supporting traditional military hierarchies. Modern nation-states required citizens whose primary loyalty belonged to secular governments, rather than religious institutions that claimed to transcend national boundaries. Even sympathetic rulers recognized that granting territorial sovereignty to an international organization would create precedents that might undermine their own authority over domestic populations. Fundamental problems that prevented restoration went beyond simple territorial questions to encompass the deeper transformation of European society that had eliminated the social foundations supporting traditional military orders. The emergence of modern nation-states, the decline of aristocratic privilege, and the secularization of political authority had created an environment where institutions like the Order could survive only by abandoning most of the characteristics that had originally defined their identity. Recognition of these realities gradually led to acceptance that territorial restoration was impossible, and that survival required adaptation to entirely new circumstances. The legitimacy crisis that had paralyzed effective leadership since Hompesch's controversial surrender demanded resolution before any meaningful reconstruction could begin. European courts that had once competed for their alliance now questioned whether any authority could legitimately speak for an organization whose sovereignty had been voluntarily surrendered. The delicate negotiations that eventually produced papal recognition in 1834, required compromises that fundamentally altered the community's constitutional position while preserving their essential spiritual mission. Pope Leo XII's bull Quod Aliquantum acknowledged their continuing existence as a religious institution, while clarifying that their claims to territorial sovereignty existed only as historical memories rather than practical realities. This distinction enabled them to maintain their unique international character while accepting papal supremacy over their internal governance. Cardinal Bartolomeo Pacca, serving as Leo XII's representative in these negotiations, demonstrated remarkable diplomatic skill in crafting formulas that satisfied both the community's desire for autonomy and the Vatican's requirement for effective control. The compromise that emerged granted them unprecedented privileges within the Papal States, while ensuring that their activities would never again challenge secular authority or complicate international relations. They could pursue their charitable mission throughout the world, but only as a religious organization operating under papal protection, rather than as an independent sovereign entity. The symbolic significance of accepting Roman headquarters extended far beyond mere administrative convenience. By placing themselves under direct papal authority while maintaining their claims to sovereign status under international law, they achieved a unique constitutional position that would enable them to pursue their charitable mission while preserving their distinctive identity. This delicate balance between medieval tradition and modern reality provided the foundation for their continued existence in an age that had little patience for outdated forms of authority. Lessons learned during the decades of exile and uncertainty had prepared the community's leadership for the challenges that lay ahead. They understood that survival required embracing change while preserving essential values, that effectiveness demanded adapting medieval institutions to modern circumstances, and that relevance in the contemporary world depended on demonstrating practical utility rather than merely invoking historical precedents. Yet even as they accepted their transformed circumstances, something essential had endured through 7 centuries of conquest and defeat, triumph and exile. The spiritual impulse that had motivated Gerard's humble caregivers in 11th century Jerusalem still burned within their hearts, though now channeled through different forms of expression. The oath to serve the sick and poor remained as binding as ever, even if the context for that service had been revolutionized beyond recognition. Their story embodied one of history's most remarkable institutional adaptations, the transformation of a medieval military order into a modern humanitarian organization without losing its fundamental identity. From the limestone cliffs of Malta to the corridors of the Vatican, from the battlefields of the Crusades to the hospitals of the modern world, they had demonstrated an extraordinary capacity for renewal that few institutions in human history had matched. The modest hospital that Amalfitan merchants had established beside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre had evolved through incarnations its founders could never have imagined. Warrior monks who had defied Ottoman expansion, sovereign princes who had ruled a maritime empire, and now servants of charity operating under papal protection. Each transformation had preserved the essential mission while adapting to the demands of changing times. As the bells of Rome announced the dawn of their new age in 1834, the last echoes of ancient battles faded into memory. The weapons were laid aside, the fortresses abandoned to history, the dreams of territorial sovereignty surrendered to revolutionary necessity. Yet something indestructible survived, a commitment to human dignity that had outlasted empires and would endure long after the last traces of their island kingdom had crumbled into the Mediterranean Sea. Gerard's hospital had become eternal, not through the preservation of stone and mortar, but through the endless renewal of compassion in service to those who suffered. The Knights Hospitaller lived on, no longer as lords of war, but as servants of mercy, carrying forward a mission that had begun in the shadow of Calvary and would continue until the end of time itself.